In the soft glow of the setting sun, let us embark on an immersive journey back to the medieval era, a period that spanned from the 5th to the 15th centuries in Europe, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance. This epoch was rich in history and societal transformation. Today, we'll focus on the lives of women during this age, an often overlooked aspect of history that is nonetheless fascinating and deeply informative. As we delve into the lives of medieval women, we must first understand the societal foundations upon which their experiences were built. The Middle Ages were a time of feudalism, a hierarchical system where land was exchanged for service and loyalty. This social structure largely defined the roles and opportunities available to women. As our minds wander through the cobbled streets of a medieval town, we can sense the struggles and triumphs that these women experienced daily. In a typical feudal society, the king or queen reigned at the top, followed by the nobility, the knights, the clergy, and finally, the peasants. Women, irrespective of their social class, were legally considered subservient to the men in their lives, be they fathers, brothers, or husbands. This was a time when societal norms and expectations were deeply rooted in patriarchy. But it would be an oversimplification to assume that all women led lives of passive submission. In fact, women of the medieval era were known to have held roles as diverse as their male counterparts. Women of the nobility, although their primary role was to bear heirs, often managed large estates in the absence of their husbands. This task required a myriad of skills, including managing finances, supervising work, and making important decisions for the estate. As we imagine a noble woman in her grand manner, we sense the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, the subtle strength in her gaze as she oversees her vast domain. Peasant women, on the other hand, led lives that were filled with hard work and toil. From sunrise to sunset, their days were spent tending to animals, cultivating crops, and taking care of their families. Their hands, coarse from relentless labor, bore the brand of their unwavering resilience. Despite the hardships they faced, these women found joy and satisfaction in their families and communities, in their shared meals and shared stories. Life was hard, but it was also filled with laughter, love, and the indomitable spirit of human resilience. Religion played a significant role in the Middle Ages, and this was no different for women. Many women found solace and purpose within the confines of the church. Some became nuns, dedicating their lives to prayer and service, while others were influential figures within their religious communities. The church provided a unique avenue for women to exercise power and influence, an opportunity that was scarce. In other spheres of medieval society, education was limited in the Middle Ages, and this was particularly true for women. However, it would be incorrect to presume that all medieval women were uneducated. Noble women and women of the church often received an education learning to read and write, to understand Latin, and to study religious texts. In contrast, peasant women were primarily educated in practical skills necessary for their daily lives. As we delve deeper into the intricacies of medieval women's lives, we begin to see the stark differences and surprising similarities with our own lives. The roles, responsibilities, and expectations placed upon them were shaped by their time. But at their core, these women were not so different from us. They loved, they struggled, they persevered, and they dreamed. They were mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters. They were leaders, workers, scholars, and believers. They were women of strength and heart, who, in their own way, shaped the world we live in today. As the sun dips below the horizon and the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, we leave the Middle Ages for now with a newfound appreciation for the women who lived during this time. But our journey is far from over, as there are countless more stories to uncover, countless more women whose lives we will explore. For now, close your eyes and imagine the echoes of their laughter, the strength of their spirit, and the richness of their legacy. As you drift off to sleep, let their stories inspire you, comfort you, and remind you of the enduring power of the human spirit. As we continue our journey into the lives of women during the medieval period, let's delve into the societal structure and the roles women played in it. It is essential to note that the Middle Ages spanned a vast period from the 5th to the 15th century, making it impossible to paint a comprehensive picture. However, we can make broad strokes to illustrate the general trends and realities. The B. Societal structure during the medieval times was predominantly feudal. The king held the highest rank, followed by nobles, knights, and then peasants, who made up the majority of the population. Women's positions in this hierarchy were defined by their association with men, be it their father, husband, or son. As such, a woman's life and status were largely determined by her birth and marriage. Noble women held a position of relative privilege. They were often educated, although not to the extent of their male counterparts. Their education typically included reading and writing, but the primary focus was on managing a household, a skill deemed crucial for noble women. In the absence of their husbands, noble women were expected to run the manor, overseeing everything from food production to resolving disputes among the servants. Despite their responsibilities, they had little power in the political sphere and were often used as pawns in political alliances and marriages. Like noble women, the lives of peasant women were also dictated by their marital status. However, unlike their noble counterparts, peasant women engaged in hard labor. They worked in the fields, looked after livestock, cooked, cleaned, and cared for their families. Their work days began at dawn and ended well after dusk, their tasks varying with the changing seasons. Life for women in towns and cities was slightly different. Women were involved in various trades and businesses, though they were often relegated to unskilled labor. Some women became alewives, brewing and selling ale, while others were bakers, spinners, or laresses. Yet, women's work was often less valued compared to men's, and they typically earned less. However, there were exceptions. Some women defied societal norms and expectations, achieving notable success in their fields. For instance, women like Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess, writer, and composer, and Julian of Norwich, a mystic, carved out unique roles for themselves, contributing to literature, music, and theology. They demonstrated that women, given the opportunity, could excel in spheres traditionally dominated by men. The Church played a significant role in the lives of medieval women. Women were viewed through the lens of Christian doctrine, often framed as either saints or sinners. The Church reiterated the idea of women being inherently sinful, drawing from the biblical story of Eve. This notion reinforced women's subordinate status, contributing to their marginalization. Nunneries offered an alternative to marriage, allowing women to lead a life dedicated to God. Although they were secluded from the wider society, nuns could receive an education and, in some cases, hold positions of authority. Marriage was an integral aspect of a woman's life during this period. It was less about love and more about economic and political alliances. Brides were often very young, and their husbands significantly older. Women had little say in choosing their partners. Once married, they were expected to bear children, preferably sons, to carry on the family name. Despite the harsh realities, women found ways to exert influence and express their individuality. They contributed to their communities, managed households, and raised children, ensuring the survival and continuity of society. Their strength and resilience are testament to their enduring spirit, a spirit that continues to inspire us today. As we close this section, let's remember that the lives of women in the Middle Ages were not monolithic. They were shaped by a multitude of factors, including class, location, and individual circumstances. In the next part of our journey, we we'll explore the cultural aspects of women's lives, including fashion, art, and entertainment. Until then, let the echoes of the past lull you into a peaceful slumber. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of history, as we delve further into the lives of medieval women, we come across the pivotal role they played in the domestic sphere. The realm of the home was not simply one of shelter and warmth, but an environment of intense labor and responsibility. Women in medieval times were the caregivers, the providers of food, clothing, and health. They were the educators, teaching their children the important skills for survival, and in some cases, even teaching them to read and write. In most households, the woman was the primary cook. Cooking was not merely a matter of heating food and serving it, but rather a complex process that involved growing, harvesting, preserving, and preparing food. Women planted and tended to the gardens, gathering fruits, vegetables, and herbs. They preserved food for the winter months, pickling, drying, and salting their harvests. They were also responsible for baking bread, a staple food in medieval diets. This task alone could take up a significant portion of a woman's day, as the onbi, dough needed to be kneaded, left to rise, and then baked in an oven that was heated by a wood fire. Clothing was another domain of women during medieval times. They would spin fiber into yarn, weave the yarn into cloth, and then sew the cloth into garments. This process was incredibly time-consuming, as every step was done by hand. Women also washed and mended clothes, knitted hats, gloves, and socks, and made shoes and boots from leather. In addition to these tasks, women were also responsible for the health of their families. They were the primary caregivers tending to the sick and the injured. Women were knowledgeable in the use of herbs and other natural remedies, and they would concoct potions, salves, and infusions to treat a variety of ailments. Childbirth, too, was the realm of women. Midwives, often older women who had given birth themselves, were called upon to assist in the birthing process. But women's responsibilities were not confined to the home. Many women worked outside the home as well. Contributing to the family income, women worked as brewers, bakers, alewives, and merchants. They ran inns, worked in mills, and operated breweries. Some even held positions of power, such as abuses, who were the female heads of monastic communities. Education, too, was a part of women's lives in medieval times. While it's true that formal education was largely reserved for men, particularly those in the clergy, women were not entirely excluded. Some women, particularly those from wealthy families, were educated by tutors and could read and write. They studied Latin, the language of the church, and they learned the skills necessary to manage a household, such as accounting and record-keeping. Yet, despite these roles and responsibilities, women in the medieval period were not considered equals to men. They were generally considered weaker, both physically and mentally, and were often depicted as being more susceptible to temptation. Women were excluded from political power and were often denied the right to own property. However, some women found ways to challenge these societal norms and carved out positions of power and influence for themselves. As we continue our exploration of women in the medieval times, we'll encounter stories of such women who defied societal expectations and left their mark on history. We'll delve into the lives of queens and noble women, of saints and mystics, and of everyday women who navigated the complexities of life in this turbulent yet fascinating period of history. But for now, close your eyes and imagine the bustling activity of a medieval home with a woman at its heart, orchestrating the rhythm of daily life. Picture her tending to the garden, kneading dough, weaving cloth, caring for the sick, teaching her children, working her trade. Despite the many challenges she faced, she was the cornerstone of her family and her community, a testament to the resilience and strength of women throughout history. As we continue our journey into the medieval period, we find ourselves exploring the domestic life of women. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure images of knights in shining armor and grand castles. But for most women, their realm was the home, the heart of everyday life. Whether they were of noble birth or humble beginnings, women were primarily associated with the domestic sphere, and as such, they had considerable responsibilities and duties to fulfill. From dawn till dusk, women in the Middle Ages were tasked with a variety of chores. Preparing food, making clothing, and caring for children were all part of the daily routine. They had to be proficient in spinning, weaving, and sewing. In the absence of modern conveniences, these tasks were labor-intensive and time-consuming. The spinning of wool, for example, could take up to 9 hours a day, leaving little time for any other pursuits. And yet, despite this heavy workload, medieval women were also expected to maintain a serene demeanor and a pleasant household environment. Cooking was another significant part of a woman's role, and it was often a complex and arduous task. Meals were not as simple as they are today. Without the luxury of refrigeration or fast food, women had to plan meals meticulously, taking into account the availability of ingredients and the changing seasons. They had to know how to preserve food, how to make cheese, how to brew beer, and how to bake bread. They also had to be knowledgeable about medicinal herbs, as they were often the primary caregivers when family members fell ill. Childbirth and childcare were, of course, important aspects of a woman's role. In a time when medical knowledge was scarce, childbirth was a dangerous and harrowing process. Women relied heavily on the support of other women in their community, whether they were midwives, relatives, or friends. Once the children were born, they were primarily cared for by their mothers, who were expected to raise them with good morals and manners. This responsibility was taken very seriously, as children were seen as the future of the family line and the community. While it might appear that women were confined to the home, this was not entirely the case. Many women were involved in business activities, especially if they were widowed or their husbands were away. They could run shops, inns, or bakeries, and they could trade in markets. They could also own land and property. The notion of women as purely domestic creatures is a myth that has been debunked by numerous historical records. Moreover, women were also involved in charitable work. They visited the sick, helped the poor, and took part in religious activities. In fact, many women found an outlet for their talents and ambitions within the church. Women could become nuns and devote their lives to prayer and service, or they could become mystics and visionaries, influencing religious thought and practice. Despite the many challenges they faced, women in the Middle Ages were resilient and resourceful. They learned to navigate the constraints of their society and to carve out spaces for themselves within it. They were far from passive or helpless. They were active agents in their own lives, contributing significantly to the functioning of their households and their communities. As we delve deeper into the lives of women in the Middle Ages, it's important to remember that their experiences were not uniform. Women's lives varied greatly depending on their social status, geographical location, and personal circumstances. However, by understanding the common threads that bound them, we can gain a fuller picture of what life was like for women during this fascinating period in history. As we close this section of our exploration, let's take a moment to reflect on the endurance and strength of these medieval women. Their lives were not easy by any means, but they persevered, shaping the course of history in ways both small and large. As we move forward, we'll delve further into the societal roles and expectations of women, their influence on the church, and their contributions to the arts and sciences. As we progress through our historical journey, we arrive at an intriguing facet of medieval life, the experience of women in education and intellectual pursuits. This is a topic that often elicits much curiosity, as the context of the Middle Ages often paints a picture of limited freedoms and opportunities for women. However, the reality is far more complex and nuanced. In the early Middle Ages, education was often a privilege of the elite, and women, irrespective of their social rank, were generally excluded from formal educational settings. Yet this did not mean that women were entirely devoid of learning. In many households, especially those of the nobility, private tutors were employed to instruct children in reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious doctrine. Girls alongside. Their brothers were recipients of this basic education, which was considered necessary for managing household affairs and understanding religious teachings. As we move into the later Middle Ages, we find an increasing emphasis on education, and surprisingly, women were not entirely excluded. It's important to note that the Church played a pivotal role in the educational landscape of this time. Convents and monasteries were among the few establishments providing formal education. Women who joined these religious institutions had access to learning that was otherwise unavailable to their counterparts in secular society. They could study Latin, read and transcribe religious texts, and even engage in scholarly debates. One such example is Hilda of Whitby, a 7th-century English abbess, who was known for her wisdom and learning. Her monastery at Whitby was a renowned center of learning, and she herself is credited with educating 5 future bishops. Hilda's story, though unique, was not entirely an anomaly. Women in religious communities across Europe were actively engaging in intellectual pursuits, contributing to the rich tapestry of medieval knowledge and culture. Yet it would be remiss not to mention the many women who were denied access to education. Women of the lower social strata, such as peasants and serfs, were primarily occupied with laborious work, leaving little time for intellectual pursuits. Even for those who had the means and the time, societal norms and expectations often acted as barriers. Women were expected to concentrate on their roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers, and the pursuit of learning was often seen as an unnecessary distraction. Nevertheless, there were women who defied these norms and carved a space for themselves in the world of letters. Christine Dayson, a writer and philosopher, is a shining example. Born in late 14th century Italy, Christine was educated by her father and later moved to France. She is known for her writings on women's rights and her critiques of the misogynistic attitudes prevalent in her society. She used her pen to challenge the status quo and assert the intellectual capabilities of women, thereby leaving an indelible mark on medieval literature and thought. As we continue our exploration of the lives of women in medieval times, it's crucial to recognize the diversity of their experiences. While many women were confined by societal norms and expectations, others were able to transcend these barriers and contribute to the intellectual legacy of the Middle Ages. These stories of resilience and defiance remind us that despite the constraints of their time, women were active participants in shaping the course of history. As the night deepens, let these tales of medieval women lull you into a peaceful slumber, inviting dreams of ancient castles, echoing cloisters, and the quiet rustle of parchment in candlelit rooms. And when you wake, may you carry with you a deeper understanding of the past and the women who helped shape it. As we journey further into the lives of women in medieval times, our focus now shifts towards education, an area often overlooked when discussing this period. We have spoken of noblewomen and peasant women, of their roles and duties. But what of their minds? What did they learn, and how did they learn it? In the early Middle Ages, education was a privilege largely reserved for males, particularly those of noble birth. However, this does not mean that women were completely devoid of knowledge. The daughters of nobility, while not often given formal education, were taught by their mothers and governesses the skills needed to run a household. This included not just domestic duties, but also lessons in management, diplomacy, and sometimes even basic reading and writing. Religious institutions, too, played a significant role in educating women. Convents were particularly important centers of learning for women, with many nuns being taught to read and write in Latin. Through the transcription of religious texts, these women were able to contribute to the intellectual culture of the time, albeit in a limited capacity. It was within these hallowed halls of the convent that women could escape the traditional roles society had laid out for them and develop their intellectual abilities. However, it is important to note that this opportunity was not available to all women. Convents were primarily places for the daughters of the nobility, while peasant women rarely had the opportunity to learn beyond the skills necessary for their daily lives. The disparity in education between noble and peasant women was a reflection of the deep social divides of the time. As the Middle Ages progressed, so too did the opportunities for women's education. The late Middle Ages saw the rise of vernacular literature, which allowed more women to access written knowledge. Women like Christine Deason, an Italian-French late medieval author, emerged as educated women who could read and write in the vernacular. Peasant is often hailed as Europe's first professional woman writer, and her works offer a fascinating insight into the intellectual life of women in the late Middle Ages. Yet even as these advancements were being made, the education of women remained a contentious issue. Many societal norms and religious beliefs of the time held that women were inferior to men and that their primary role was to bear children and maintain the household. These views often led to the marginalization of women in educational institutions, with very few being allowed to study at the newly emerging universities. Despite these challenges, medieval women demonstrated a remarkable resilience in their pursuit of knowledge. They found ways to educate themselves, whether it be through the teachings of their mothers, the tutelage of the convent, or the clandestinish. Reading of vernacular literature, their stories serve as a testament to the enduring human spirit and its quest for knowledge, even in the most restrictive of circumstances. As we move towards a closer look at the roles of women in medieval society, it is essential to remember that these women were not just wives and mothers, but also learners and sometimes teachers. Theirs were lives of complexity and nuance shaped by the times in which they lived, but also by their own desires and ambitions. As we continue our journey, let us keep these revelations in mind, acknowledging the struggles and triumphs of these women who lived so long ago. Our exploration of women's lives during medieval times is far from over. In the next section, we will delve into the world of work, exploring the roles women played in the economy of the Middle Ages. From the fields to the marketplaces, from the home to the workshop, we will discover the myriad ways in which women contributed to their societies. But for now, let us pause and reflect on the lessons we have learned from the women of the past and the paths they have paved for the women of the future. As we continue our journey back in time to the Middle Ages, we now find ourselves exploring the roles and expectations of women within the realm of education and literacy. While education during this era was not as we understand it today, it played a significant role in shaping the lives of women, particularly those within higher social classes. The opportunity to receive an education was largely determined by a woman's social standing. Noble women were often given the right to education, though it was a privilege not extended to all. Learning was often conducted within the confines of a monastery or a convent, where girls were taught by nuns in a range of subjects such as reading, writing, music, and embroidery. These institutions provided a space for women to learn, create, and express themselves, which was quite a rarity in a time when most of society was dominated by men. Despite the societal limitations imposed on them, some women were able to grasp the opportunity for education and used it to make a significant impact on society. The remarkable Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, was an abbess, artist, composer, and writer who is remembered to this day for her religious visions and her contributions to music and literature. However, it is crucial to remember that the majority of women during the Middle Ages were not as fortunate. Women of lower social classes, such as peasants, were typically deprived of any formal education. Their lives were devoted to hard manual labor in fields or at home, where they tended to their families and household chores. Their education was limited to learning practical skills necessary for survival, such as cooking, weaving, and brewing. Literacy was another area where the divide between the social classes was starkly evident. While noble women may have had the opportunity to learn to read and write, this was not a common skill amongst the lower classes. Reading and writing were viewed as luxuries, available only to those in religious orders or the upper echelons of society. For peasant women, their illiteracy did not signify a lack of intelligence, but rather a reflection of the social norms and confines of their era. In stark contrast to this, there were women renowned for their intellect and literary contributions like Christine Despins. Born in Italy and later moved to France, Despins was one of the first women to earn a living through writing. She penned numerous works on a variety of subjects, from romantic ballads to works of feminist literature. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a groundbreaking piece of feminist literature that defended women and their capacity for learning, challenging the misogynistic attitudes of her time. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of the Beguines, a community of religious women who lived in semi-monastic communities known as beginnings. These women were not nuns, nor were they tied to a specific religious order. They dedicated their lives to prayer and good works, often supporting themselves through various crafts or teaching. Many bands were well-educated and literate, contributing to religious literature of the time. In the realm of education and literacy, it becomes clear that women in the Middle Ages navigated a complex array of societal norms and expectations. Despite the constraints of their time, many women sought knowledge and learning, leaving a lasting impact on the historical record. Their stories remind us of the resilience and adaptability of women who, against all odds, managed to carve out spaces for themselves to learn, create, and contribute to their societies. As we transition into our next section, we will delve further into the roles and responsibilities of women in the workforce during the Middle Ages. We will explore the various occupations open to women, the challenges they faced, and the invaluable contributions they made to their societies. So close your eyes and allow yourself to be transported back in time to the bustling markets and workshops of medieval Europe, and let the stories of these remarkable women lull you into a peaceful slumber. As we continue our journey through the life of women in the medieval period, we find ourselves delving into the realm of work and labor. It is indeed a common misconception that medieval women were confined solely to the domestic sphere, limited to the roles of wives and mothers. This notion, while partially true, overlooks the vast array of occupations and roles that women undertook during this time. In the Middle Ages, the work a woman did was largely determined by her social status. Noble women, despite their elevated position in society, were expected to manage their households, oversee the education of their children, and sometimes even supervise the running of their husbands' estates in their absence. This management could involve the coordination of a large number of servants and workers, making it an intense and demanding role. Lower down the social ladder, peasant women's work was primarily agricultural. In an agrarian society, the majority of the population lived and worked on the land. Women would have been involved in all aspects of food production, from planting and harvesting crops to managing livestock. They would also have been responsible for a multitude of domestic tasks, including cooking, brewing, spinning, weaving, and looking after the children. In towns and cities, women could sometimes be found working in a variety of trades. Records show that women worked as bakers, brewers, silk makers, and even blacksmiths. Some women even ran their own businesses, often taking over their husband's trade if he passed away. This was not always easy, however, as guilds often restricted women's participation in certain trades and professions. While many women did work, it's important to note that their work was often devalued compared to men's. They were frequently paid less than men for the same work, and their labor was often considered secondary to their duties as wives and mothers. This devaluation of women's work has persisted into the modern era, a reminder of the long history of gender inequality. Despite the constraints placed on them, women in the Middle Ages demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They navigated a society that often limited their opportunities, carving out spaces for themselves in the world of work. They were essential contributors to the economy, the functioning of their households, and the well-being of their communities. Even in religious life, women found ways to contribute to society. Many women became nuns, dedicating their lives to the service of God. Within the confines of the convent, they could become scholars, teachers, nurses, and leaders. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, became renowned for their intellectual contributions, writing works on theology, botany, and medicine. As we reflect on the lives of women in the Middle Ages, it's clear that they were far from passive figures. They worked hard, often under difficult conditions, to support their families and communities. Their stories remind us of the strength and resilience of women throughout history, inspiring us to continue striving for gender equality in our own time. In our next section, we'll explore another crucial aspect of life for medieval women, their roles within the family and their experiences of marriage and motherhood. We'll delve into the customs and expectations of medieval marriage, the responsibilities of wives and mothers, and the challenges they faced. As we do, we'll continue to shed light on the complex and often overlooked lives of women in the Middle Ages. As darkness fell across the medieval countryside, a chill would settle in the air, and the sounds of the day would taper off. The women of the household would retreat indoors, their day's work completed, and the family would gather around the hearth for a meal. It was a time for stories, for shared laughter, and for the comforting routine of family life. This was the backbone of medieval society, the basic unit of organization, and women were at its very heart. The meal would typically consist of hearty, simple fare, the product of the family's own labor. Bread, cheese, and ale were the staples, supplemented by whatever fruits, vegetables, or meats the season allowed. The women of the house would have spent a good part of the day preparing this meal, grinding grain, kneading dough, tending the fire, and stirring the pot. It was hard physical labor, but it was also a deeply ingrained part of their lives, a rhythm they knew as well as their own. Heartbeat. After the meal, the family might gather around the fire for a time of storytelling and music. The tales they told were rich and varied, drawn from a deep well of tradition and folklore. Women played a crucial role in this oral tradition, passing down stories from one generation to the next, preserving the collective memory and wisdom of the community. They were the keepers of the cultural flame, the guardians of the community's shared identity. Despite the hardships and limitations of their lives, many women in the Middle Ages found ways to exercise agency and assert their individuality. Some became skilled artisans, producing beautiful textiles, pottery, and other goods. Others became healers, using their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies to treat the sick and injured. Still others became nuns, devoting their lives to spiritual pursuits and often gaining a measure of freedom and autonomy not available to their secular counterparts. Indeed, the convent was one of the few places in medieval society where a woman could receive a formal education. The nuns would learn to read and write, to study the scriptures, and to engage in theological debates. They would also learn practical skills like gardening, brewing, and bookbinding. In a world where women's roles were largely defined by their relationships to men, the convent offered a different path, a chance to live a life of the mind and the spirit. But even for those women who remained in the secular world, there were opportunities for learning and intellectual growth. Women often played a key role in educating their children, passing on their own knowledge and skills. They might also learn from their husbands, fathers, or brothers, picking up bits and pieces of their trade or craft, and in some cases, women might even take over a family business after the death of their husband, demonstrating their competence and capability in a very public way. Yet for all their strength and resilience, women in the Middle Ages also faced considerable challenges. They were often seen as inferior to men both physically and intellectually, and their roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They had few legal rights, and their social status was largely dependent on their husband or father. In times of conflict or crisis, they were often the ones who suffered most, bearing the brunt of war, famine, and disease. But through it all, women in the Middle Ages showed a remarkable capacity for endurance and adaptability. They found ways to navigate the constraints of their society, to carve out spaces for themselves, to assert their own identity and agency. And in doing so, they shaped the world around them in ways both big and small. The life of a woman in the Middle Ages was not easy, but it was not without its rewards. There was the warmth of the hearth, the companionship of family and friends, the satisfaction of a job well done. There was the rhythm of the seasons, the beauty of the natural world, the joy of song and story. And there was the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, a vast tapestry of human experience stretching back through the centuries. As we delve deeper into the lives of women in the Middle Ages, we find a story of strength and resilience, of creativity and adaptability, of courage and determination. It is a story that resonates across the centuries, echoing in the lives of women today. And it is a story that deserves to be told. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a sense of admiration for these women of the Middle Ages who navigated a world that offered them few opportunities with strength, grace, and resilience. In the quiet of the night, as the hearth's fire dwindles and the moon rises high in the sky, we bid them good night, knowing that their stories and their spirit continue to live on. As we continue our exploration of the lives of women during the medieval period, it is essential to remember that the era spanned several centuries and encompassed a variety of cultures and societies. So, it is not a one-size-fits-all narrative. Nonetheless, there are common threads and experiences that tie together the life stories of women in this time. In the previous section, we delved into how women's lives were dictated by their social status and the roles they played within their families. Now, let's turn our focus towards the experience of women in the realms of education and intellectual life. Education in the Middle Ages was a privilege enjoyed by few, and fewer still were the women who could access it. That is not to say women were entirely excluded from intellectual pursuits. The avenues for women's education were largely tied to their social status and the institutions available to them. Noblewomen, for instance, were often educated within their households. They were taught the necessary social graces and skills befitting their status, such as managing a household, embroidery, music, and sometimes even reading and writing. These were considered the acceptable areas of knowledge for a woman of noble birth, focused on ensuring she could run a household efficiently and be a gracious hostess. The church also played a significant role in women's education. Convents were among the few places where women could receive a more comprehensive education. Girls sent to convents, usually those from noble families, would learn to read and write. They would be taught Latin, the language of the church, and some even studied philosophy, theology, and the sciences. These women, known as nuns, often produced works of literature, art, and music that have survived to this day. Consider the case of Hildegard of Bingen, a German nun of the 12th century. She was a polymath who made contributions to music, theology, natural science, and philosophy. She wrote visionary works and composed liturgical songs, marking her as one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages. However, the intellectual life of women in the Middle Ages was not confined to the nobility or the church. In towns and cities, women could be found in various professions, including teaching. Schools attached to cathedrals and monasteries sometimes employed women as teachers. Although these schools primarily catered to boys, they occasionally admitted girls, providing another avenue for women's education. In addition to formal education, women also engaged in intellectual pursuits through informal means. Storytelling and folk wisdom passed down from generation to generation carried the collective knowledge of women. They knew about medicinal herbs, childbirth techniques, and practical solutions to everyday problems. This knowledge, though not recognized as formal education, was critical in the functioning of households and communities. Despite these opportunities, it is important to note that the majority of women during the medieval period remained uneducated. Literacy rates among women were significantly lower than among men. The prevailing societal norms and limitations placed on women's access to education played a significant role in this disparity. Yet the women who defied these norms and pursued education often left a lasting impact. Their contributions to literature, science, philosophy, and other fields of knowledge are testaments to their intellectual capabilities and resilience. They carved out spaces for themselves in a world that often sought to limit them, leaving a legacy that has endured through the centuries. As we close this section and prepare to journey further into the world of medieval women, let us remember these women, their stories, and their indomitable spirit. It serves as a reminder of the potential that lies within each individual, waiting to be nurtured and expressed regardless of the constraints of their time. In the next section, we shall explore the roles and experiences of women in the workforce during the medieval period, a topic that offers further insight into the diverse experiences of these women. So, as your eyes grow heavy and your body relaxes into the comforting embrace of your bed, allow the tales of these extraordinary women to accompany you into the realm of dreams, where perhaps you might meet them in the grand tapestry of history. It's a common assumption that all medieval women, regardless of their social rank or geographical location, lived lives of confinement and hardship, devoid of any semblance of power or influence. However, this blanket portrayal doesn't wholly represent the reality of women's experiences during the Middle Ages. While it's true that societal norms and religious doctrines often undermine their status, women in various capacities found ways to navigate these constraints, demonstrating resilience and resourcefulness. In the realm of work, women were involved in a variety of occupations. They were not solely confined to the domestic sphere as is often depicted. Indeed, some were engaged in tasks directly related to the home and family, such as cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. But many women also contributed economically to their households. They worked in fields, tended to animals, and helped to manage family businesses. In urban settings, women could be found in a range of professions, from brewing and baking to weaving and midwifery. Some even ran their own businesses, a testament to their entrepreneurial spirit. In the higher echelons of society, noble women held positions of considerable power and influence. They managed large estates, oversaw the household staff, and the absence of their husbands, they could exercise power as regents, governing in their stead. Some queens, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine and Matilda of Tuscany, are renowned for their political acumen and leadership skills, proving that women were more than capable of ruling in a male-dominated world. Education, though not universally accessible, was not entirely out of reach for women either. In monastic communities, nuns received instruction in Latin, scripture studies, and sometimes even sciences, making these institutions important centers of female learning. In aristocratic families, girls were taught by private tutors, gaining knowledge in languages, music, and literature. However, it's important to note that life in the Middle Ages was not without its hardships for women. The societal norms of the time were deeply entrenched in patriarchal values. Women were seen as inferior to men both physically and mentally and were expected to be obedient and subservient. This was reflected in the legal system, where women had limited rights. For instance, they could not hold public office, and their ability to own and inherit property was restricted. Religion, too, played a role in shaping women's lives. The teaching of the Church placed women in a subordinate position, emphasizing their roles as wives and mothers. The concept of original sin, tied to the biblical figure of Eve, was used to justify their lower status. However, religion also provided avenues for female empowerment. Many women found solace and purpose in religious life, becoming nuns or joining lay religious communities. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich used their religious devotion as a platform to express their thoughts and ideas, making significant contributions to theology and literature. The reality of medieval women's lives was one of contrast and complexity. They faced numerous barriers and challenges, but they also demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity. They worked, learned, ruled, and created, leaving their mark on the world in ways that continue to resonate today. Their stories remind us that even in the face of adversity, women have always found ways to carve out spaces of autonomy and influence. As we delve deeper into the lives of medieval women, we uncover a rich tapestry of experiences that challenge our preconceived notions. From the humblest peasant to the most powerful queen, from the devout nun to the skilled artisan, each had a unique story to tell, a testament to the diverse roles and contributions of women during this period. Through exploring these narratives, we gain a more nuanced understanding of the medieval world, one that recognizes and celebrates women's integral role in shaping history. As we delve deeper into the realm of medieval women's lives, it becomes clear that their roles and responsibilities were largely determined by their social status. The life of a woman was not uniform. Instead, it was a spectrum of experiences influenced by factors such as wealth, birth, marriage, and location. Let's now explore the life of women in the upper echelons of society, the nobility. Noble women, while still subjected to the societal limitations of their gender, enjoyed a slightly more privileged existence. They were typically educated, albeit in a limited capacity compared to their male counterparts. Their education primarily focused on managing a household and estate, as well as learning courtly etiquette. They were also taught how to read and write, with many noble women becoming patrons of literature and arts. Some even penned their own works, such as Marie de France, who was one of the most renowned poets of the 12th century. The primary duty of a noble woman was to bear and raise children, particularly sons, who would continue the family line. Marriage was often a political arrangement designed to secure alliances, wealth, or land. Love was rarely, if ever, a deciding factor. Despite this, there are accounts of affectionate relationships between noble couples, suggesting that emotional bonds could develop over time. As the lady of the manor, a noble woman was responsible for managing the household. This involved overseeing the domestic staff, ensuring the smooth running of the estate, and often managing finances. In the event of her husband's absence due to war or travel, she would assume his responsibilities, effectively running the estate. These duties required considerable administrative acumen, highlighting the significant role women played in the functioning of the medieval society. However, the life of a medieval noble woman was not without its hardships. Pregnancy and childbirth were perilous, with many women dying in childbirth or from related complications. Noble women also faced the threat of violence, particularly during periods of political instability. Abductions for political or financial gain were not uncommon, and noblewomen were often the targets. Let's shift our gaze now to the women of the Yass, middle class, the burghers, or bourgeoisie. These women were typically the wives or daughters of merchants or artisans. Like noble women, their primary role was to run the household and raise children. However, they were also heavily involved in their husbands' businesses. They could be found selling goods in the market, keeping the accounts, or even running the business in their husband's absence. Education was less common amongst middle-class women, but literacy rates were higher than those of peasant women. Middle-class women also had opportunities to work independently. There were guilds for various trades, and women could become members, allowing them to work as professionals. Some women became successful in their own right, such as Margery Kemper, an English mystic and author, and Julian of Norwich, an anchor, and one of the first women to write a book in English. Peasant women, on the other hand, had a markedly different existence. Their lives were dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. They worked long hours in the fields, tended to animals, and managed the household. Despite the grueling nature of their work, peasant women had little social or economic freedom. Their lives were often characterized by poverty and hardship. Despite the stark differences in their lifestyles, all medieval women shared some common experiences. They all lived in a society that valued them less than men, and their opportunities were limited by their gender. However, they found ways to exert influence and control over their lives. Whether as a lady of the manor, a guild member, or a peasant, women played a crucial role in the functioning of the medieval society. As we continue our journey, we'll delve deeper into the unique roles and experiences of women in medieval times, shedding light on their struggles, achievements, and resilience. So, close your eyes and let the echoes of the past lull you to sleep. As we journey further into the heart of medieval womanhood, as we delve deeper into the lives of women during the medieval era, we encounter the oft misunderstood realm of women in the workforce. It is an often mistaken belief that women during this time were confined solely to domestic roles. However, like the tapestry of history itself, the roles and responsibilities of women during the medieval era are far more intricate and varied. Let's take a moment to paint a picture of a bustling medieval town, the cobblestone streets teeming with activity. Among the vendors selling their wares and craftsmen tending to their trades, you would find women. Women worked in a variety of roles, often dictated by their social status. The wives and daughters of tradesmen might be seen assisting in the family business, while wealthier women might manage servants and oversee their husbands' estates. Lower-class women often worked alongside their husbands in the fields or tended to animals. The physical strain was hard, but these tasks were necessary for survival. Women also found employment in domestic service, particularly in the homes of the wealthy. They would perform a variety of tasks from cooking and cleaning to nursing and child-rearing. For women of the middle class, the roles were slightly different. Many of them worked in trades and businesses. They were spinners, dyers, bakers, brewers, and even blacksmiths. Some ran their own businesses, such as alehouses, inns, or shops. In fact, a widow could inherit her husband's business and run it herself. A surprising level of independence for the time. Even in the upper echelons of society, noble women had responsibilities beyond simply maintaining their appearance. They were expected to manage the household and its servants, oversee the education of their children, and often run the estate in their husband's absence. They also played a significant role in social and political networking, influencing their husbands' business dealings and political decisions. The sphere of religion also offered opportunities for women. Becoming a nun was a respected career choice, often pursued by women seeking education or spiritual fulfillment. In the monastery, they could gain literacy and learn various skills. Some nuns became scribes, illuminating manuscripts, while others served as nurses or teachers. It wasn't unusual for a woman to rise to a high rank within the religious institution, such as an abbess who had considerable power and influence. Despite these roles, it is important to note that women's work was often undervalued compared to men's. They were often paid less for the same work, and their contributions were frequently overlooked or minimized in historical records. However, this should not diminish the fact that women were an integral part of the medieval workforce, contributing to their family's income and the economy of the town or city. In addition to labor, women also played a crucial role in the reproduction and maintenance of the social order. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement, often arranged by families to secure alliances, consolidate wealth, or gain social status. Women were generally expected to obey their husbands, bear and raise children, and maintain the household. However, they also had certain legal protections and could own property, and in certain circumstances, they could seek separation or divorce. Despite the challenges and constraints they faced, women in the medieval ages found ways to exert influence and assert their agency. They worked, they managed, they created, and they endured. Their lives were far from easy, but they were not merely passive observers of their fate. They were active participants in their world, shaping and being shaped by the forces of history. As we continue our journey through the medieval era, we will see more of how women navigated the complexities of their time, finding strength and resilience in the face of adversity. The tapestry of history is rich and complex, and the threads woven by the women of the medieval era are a vital part of that intricate design. The echoes of their lives resonate in our world today, reminding us of our shared history and the enduring power of the human spirit. As you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts wander through the streets of a medieval town, following the footsteps of the women who once walked there. As we navigate through the annals of history, we find ourselves now in the realm of medieval, women's experiences with education and intellectual pursuits. While it is true that many historical accounts of this period focus on the deeds and exploits of men, it would be a gross oversimplification to assume that women were absent from the intellectual life of the Middle Ages. Education in medieval times was not a universal right, but rather a privilege only accessible to the wealthy or those in religious orders. However, it is important to note that women were not entirely excluded from this privilege. While it was rare for women to receive formal education, it was not unheard of. Daughters of nobility and the upper classes were sometimes given the opportunity to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. They were also taught to manage household affairs, which could be a complex task in a large state, requiring knowledge of accounts, management of servants, and often intricate social protocol. In the realm of academia, women mostly remained on the sidelines. But there were exceptions. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess, mystic, philosopher, and musician, defied societal norms and contributed significantly to the intellectual discourse of the time. Her holistic approach to health, spirituality, and the natural world was revolutionary for her time and continues to be studied today. She wrote numerous works on subjects as diverse as theology, boty, and music, offering a glimpse into the intellectual capabilities of women during this era. The medieval period was also when the tradition of female mystics began to flourish. Julian of Norwich, an English anchorite, is known for her book Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the first book written in English by a woman. These women, often part of religious orders, explored their spirituality and shared their insights in writings that have become integral to understanding the religious thought of the Middle Ages. In the realm of literature, women also made their mark. Marie de France, a poet from the 12th century, is one of the earliest known female poets writing in French and Old English. She penned Lace, a form of lyrical narrative poetry that often explored courtly love and chivalric adventure. Her works offer a rich tapestry of medieval life embodying a female perspective that was uncommon in literary works of the time. For many women, however, education was informal, passed down through generations. Skills such as weaving, brewing, and herbalism were taught from mother to daughter or within communities. Women were the keepers of practical knowledge necessary for everyday survival, and their wisdom often extended well beyond the home. They served as midwives, healers, and wise women, roles that required extensive knowledge of herbs and medicine. Despite the constraints placed on them, the women of the Middle Ages found ways to engage with intellectual pursuits. They navigated societal norms and expectations, finding loopholes and pushing boundaries to garner knowledge and express their thoughts. This era saw the emergence of strong, learned women who defied the limitations of their time, demonstrating that the thirst for knowledge and the desire to contribute were not exclusive to the male domain. As the night draws in, let us appreciate the women who, against the odds, engaged with the intellectual life of the Middle Ages. Their stories serve as reminders of the resilience and capacity of the human spirit to seek knowledge, even in the most challenging circumstances. As we drift closer to sleep, let us carry with us the image of these women huddled over their manuscripts or brewing their healing potions, their minds alive with curiosity and wonder in a world that often sought to limit them. These women, like the stars that begin to twinkle in the night sky, were points of light in the vast expanse of history, their contributions illuminating paths for the women who would follow in their footsteps. In the next section, we will explore women's roles in medieval society, focusing on their work and occupations. While many women were confined to their homes, others ventured out into the world, taking on roles and responsibilities that challenged the societal norms of their time. As you drift off to sleep, let the stories of these remarkable women lull you into a peaceful slumber, their strength and resilience serving as a testament to the power of the human spirit. As we continue our journey into the lives of women in medieval times, we arrive at the pivotal role that religion played. The church was not just a place of worship during this period. It was the center around which all life revolved. For women, the church offered several paths and opportunities. There were women who chose to dedicate their lives to the service of God, living as nuns in a convent. This was a significant choice, for it meant renouncing all worldly possessions, family ties, and the prospect of marriage. Cloistered away in their convents, these women led lives of prayer and contemplation. They followed a strict daily routine that included communal prayer, private meditation, and work that benefited the convent, such as tending to the herb garden, nursing the sick, weaving, and brewing. The nuns were also educated, a rarity in a time when literacy was not common, especially among women. They read and wrote in Latin, copied manuscripts, and produced beautiful works of religious art. Women who were not cloistered away in convents had different religious responsibilities. They were expected to attend Mass regularly, observe the holy days, and follow the Church's teachings on morality and conduct. They were also tasked with the religious education of their children, instilling in them the principles and stories of the Christian faith. Not all women, however, found their place within the confines of the Church's teachings. There were women who were healers, midwives, and herbalists who held knowledge passed down from generations. Their work was often viewed with suspicion, as it was not always in line with the Church's understanding of the world. Some of these women were even accused of witchcraft, a grave crime that could lead to their execution. The Church also had a significant influence on women's legal rights. Canon law, the law of the Church, had clear positions on issues such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance, which heavily impacted women's lives. While a woman could own property in her own right, her legal status was often tied to that of her husband or father, Marriage was viewed as a sacrament, a holy bond between a man and a woman. The church expected women to be obedient to their husbands, as they were considered the spiritual heads of the household. Divorce, while technically possible, was difficult to obtain and carried a heavy social stigma. Furthermore, women who were divorced or widowed often found themselves in a precarious situation, as they were dependent on the goodwill of male relatives for their survival. Despite these challenges, there are instances of women who wielded considerable power during this period. Queens and noblewomen often acted as regents, ruling in the stead of their underage sons or absent husbands. They managed estates, brokered political alliances, and even led armies. Their power, however, was often dependent on their relationship with a man, and they faced constant scrutiny and criticism for stepping outside the prescribed roles for women. In the world of commerce, too, women played a part. While they were not as common as male merchants or tradesmen, there were women who ran their own businesses. They were bakers, brewers, weavers, and even moneylenders. These women were often widows who had taken over their husband's business after his death. They faced numerous obstacles, from the reluctance of male merchants to do business with them to the legal restrictions that limited their ability to enter contracts or borrow money. The lives of women in medieval times were shaped by the church, the law, and societal expectations. They navigated a world that was often harsh and unforgiving, finding ways to survive and even thrive. Their stories are a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of women throughout history. As we peel back the layers of the medieval world, we find a rich tapestry of lives lived with courage and conviction. With the passing of time, the societal norms and regulations of the medieval age began to evolve, and women found themselves shouldering a different set of expectations. The later Middle Ages saw the emergence of a new kind of woman, one who was not confined to the home, but was instead engaged in various economic activities. In this era, we witnessed the rise of women as shopkeepers, bakers, brewers, and even as moneylenders. Although these roles were still rather limiting, they did provide women with a certain degree of financial independence. In towns and cities, women could be found engaging in a wide array of trades. They were tailor, candle makers, weavers, and silk workers. They were also employed in the food industry as bakers, brewers, and butchers. A woman could also run a stall in the market, selling everything from fresh produce to handcrafted goods. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-4th century, also opened up new opportunities for women. With so many lives lost, labor was in high demand, and women stepped in to fill the void. But this increased participation in economics activities did not alter the traditional perception of women as fundamentally inferior beings. Despite their contributions, women were still subjugated, and their work was often undervalued. In many cases, women were paid less than men for doing the same work. They were often subjected to discriminatory laws and practices. For instance, if a woman were to commit a crime, her husband would be held responsible for her actions. One of the most fascinating phenomena of the later Middle Ages is the emergence of women as moneylenders. With their husbands off fighting in wars or on crusades, women were left in charge of the family's finances. They would lend money to those in need, charging interest on the loans. This practice not only provided women with a source of income, but also granted them a certain degree of power within their communities. However, these women were often the target of criticism and suspicion. They were seen as shrewd and manipulative, and their activities were regarded with distrust. In addition to their economic roles, women also played crucial roles in the religious life of the Middle Ages. Many women joined religious orders, becoming nuns and dedicating their lives to prayer and service. Some women even founded their own religious communities, such as Hildegard of Bingen and Clare of Issy. These women were revered for their sanctity and wisdom, and their writings have had a profound impact on Christian theology. Yet even within the church, women were subjected to discrimination. They were barred from holding positions of authority and were often relegated to roles that kept them in the background. Despite this, some women managed to rise above these restrictions and make their voices heard. Julian of Norwich, for instance, was a mystic and theologian whose writings have had a lasting impact on Christian thought. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the status of women began to decline. The advent of the printing press, for instance, resulted in the loss of many jobs traditionally held by women. The Reformation also brought about a shift in societal attitudes towards women. The ideal of the obedient, submissive wife became more prevalent, and women were increasingly confined to the home. Yet, despite these setbacks, women continued to play vital roles in society. They were mothers, wives, and workers. They contributed to the economy and to the spiritual life of their communities. They faced adversity with resilience and tenacity. And though their stories are often overlooked, they are an integral part of the rich tapestry of the Middle Ages. Indeed, the lives of women in the Middle Ages were shaped by a complex interplay of societal norms, religious beliefs, and economic realities. Their experiences were varied and diverse, reflecting the multi-asset nature of medieval society. From the noble woman in her castle to the peasant woman in her field, from the nun in her convent to the merchant woman in her shop, each woman had her own unique story to tell. And though they lived in a time of great hardship and inequality, these women found ways to assert their agency and make their mark on the world. As we continue our journey into the fascinating realm of the Middle Ages, we delve into the topic of education and learning for women. It's important to remember that our understanding of these times is often skewed by the lack of written records from women themselves. Most of what we know comes from religious texts, legal documents, or accounts written by men. Despite these limitations, historians have gleaned a remarkable understanding of women's education during the medieval period. Contrary to common belief, women were not entirely excluded from learning, but their access to education was heavily influenced by their social status and the attitudes of the time. In the early Middle Ages, the church was the primary provider of education. Monastic schools run by monks and nuns were the primary centers of learning. Girls from noble families were often sent to these institutions to receive a basic education. These girls learned to read and write in Latin and were taught the Psalms and other religious texts. However, their education was not solely focused on the spiritual. They were also taught practical skills such as weaving and embroidery, which were deemed suitable for women. As we move into the High Middle Ages, the rise of universities dramatically changed the landscape of education. While these institutions were overwhelmingly male-dominated, women were not entirely barred from these seats of learning. In fact, there are records of a few women who were able to defy societal norms and receive a higher education. These were exceptional cases and often required extraordinary circumstances, such as the support of a powerful male relative or the willingness to live a life of celibacy. For the majority of women, however, education was a more domestic affair. Girls were taught by their mothers and other female relatives, learning the skills needed to run a household. They learned to spin and weave, to preserve food and brew ale, to manage servants and oversee the family's finances. These skills were not deemed less important than the academic knowledge taught in schools. In fact, in many ways, they were considered more valuable as they directly contributed to the survival and prosperity of the family. Education for women was not just about learning practical skills, but also about understanding societal norms and expectations. Women were taught their place in society and the behaviors expected of them. In particular, they were taught the virtues of chastity, obedience, and silence. These lessons were reinforced through religious teachings which emphasized the importance of these virtues for women. However, despite these restrictions, women found ways to express themselves and contribute to society. They found creative outlets in the arts and crafts, in the writing of letters, and the creation of household goods. Some women became influential figures in their communities, using their knowledge and skills to shape societal norms and values. In cities, women had more opportunities for learning and self-expression. They could join guilds, which provided a sense of community and offered opportunities for learning and advancement. Some women even became successful business owners, managing their own shops and trading goods. These women were often widows who had inherited their husband's business, but there were also cases of unmarried women or wives who ran businesses independently of their husbands. As we conclude this section, it's important to remember that while the Middle Ages were a time of restrictions and limitations for women, they were also a time of resilience and adaptability. Women found ways to navigate the constraints of their society, using their knowledge and skills to carve out a place for themselves. They may not have had the same opportunities as men, but they were not passive observers of their own lives. They were active participants, shaping their world and leaving a legacy that continues to inspire us today. As we settle into a comfortable silence, let the soothing rhythm of history lull you into a peaceful sleep. We will continue our journey into the lives of medieval women in the next section, exploring their roles in religion and spirituality. Until then, let the tales of these resilient women inspire dreams of strength and perseverance. Good night. As we delve deeper into the lives of medieval women, we cannot overlook the significant role they played in the religious sphere. The Church was a fundamental institution during the Middle Ages, and for women it offered some of the few opportunities for literacy, influence, and a degree of independence. In this context, it's essential to highlight the lives of nuns. The convent was one of the few places where a woman could receive an education. Here, they not only learned to read and write, but could also study theology, music, and the sciences. Nuns became scribes, illuminating manuscripts with delicate precision and artistry. Some of the most beautiful medieval manuscripts we have today are the work of these devout women. In contrast to the limited opportunities outside, the convent provided a degree of freedom. As nuns, women could hold positions of authority, become abbesses, and manage large estates. They could exercise a degree of power and control that was often denied to their secular counterparts. However, this life was not for everyone. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that nuns took were demanding. The strict discipline and the austere lifestyle could be harsh and unyielding, but for some women, the spiritual rewards outweighed the physical hardships. These women found in the convent a sanctuary from the challenges of the world outside. It is also worth mentioning the Binds, a lay religious movement that emerged in the 12th century. These were women who lived in semi-monastic communities, dedicating their lives to prayer and charitable works without taking formal vows. The Begans were particularly active in the Low Countries, and Germany and their communities, known as Biennages, provided an alternative to marriage or the convent for many women. On the other hand, women also played a crucial role in promoting religion in the domestic sphere. As wives and mothers, they were responsible for the spiritual well-being of their households. They taught their children the rudiments of the faith, ensured their families attended Mass, and observed the necessary religious festivals and fasts. In a more mystical sense, the Middle Ages also saw an upsurge in female mystics and visionaries. Women like Julian of Norwich, Margery Kempe, and Hildegard of Bingen have left us with some of the most profound and moving accounts of religious experience from this period. Their writings offer us a deep insight into the spiritual lives of medieval women. Yet even within the Church, women faced limitations. They could not become priests or bishops, and their voices were often marginalized. Women who stepped outside of the traditional boundaries could face harsh consequences. For instance, Marguerite Poré, a Béan from northern France, was burned at the stake for heresy in 1310. Overall, the Church offered both opportunities and constraints for medieval women. It provided an avenue for education and a measure of independence. Yet, it could also reinforce societal expectations and limitations. However, despite these restrictions, many women found ways to shape their religious lives, carving out spaces for spiritual expression and leadership. In the next section, we will explore the roles women played in the economy and the professions during the Middle Ages. We'll delve into the world of alewives, midwives, and merchant women, illuminating another facet of women's lives during this period. As you drift into sleep, let the stories of these remarkable women linger in your thoughts, painting a vivid picture of a world that was both challenging and full of possibilities. As our journey through the Middle Ages continues, let us focus on the intricate tapestry of women's lives during this period, a narrative as rich and varied as the medieval era itself. Women's roles were as diverse as the castles dotting the landscape. From noblewomen to peasants, from the cloistered life of the convent to the bustling streets of medieval cities. One of the defining aspects of life for women in the medieval period was marriage, a social institution that shaped their destiny in profound ways. For noble women, marriage was often a political tool used to secure alliances between powerful families. These women were typically married off at a young age, sometimes as young as 12, which was the legal age for marriage during the Middle Ages. These marriages were not based on love or attraction, but on the strategic interests of their families. They were expected to bear children, particularly sons, to continue their husband's lineage and to manage the household, which, in the case of noble families, could be as large and complex as a small village. Conversely, peasant women married a bit later, typically in their late teens or early 20s. Their marriages were more likely to be based on mutual consent and economic considerations. A peasant woman would usually marry a man from her own social class, and their life together would be centered around the grueling work of maintaining a subsistence-level existence. These women worked alongside their husbands in the fields, tended to animals, maintained the home, and took care of children. Despite the relative freedom peasant women had in choosing their husbands, their lives were far from easy. The daily grind of life in the Middle Ages was harsh and unrelenting. Women were expected to give birth to many children, as infant mortality was high and the extra hands were needed for work. This constant cycle of childbirth and work took a significant toll on women's health. However, not all women in the Middle Ages were wives and mothers. Some chose or were chosen to lead a religious life in convents. These women, known as nuns, lived lives of prayer and contemplation, secluded from the outside world. The convent was one of the few places where women could receive an education during the Middle Ages, studying Latin, scripture, and in some cases, philosophy and natural sciences. Some convents even became centers of cultural and intellectual life, with nuns producing beautiful manuscripts and contributing to theological debates. Life in the convent was not without its hardships. Nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing worldly pleasures and dedicating their lives to God. They lived in communal dormitories, known as dormitories, prayed several times a day, and performed manual labor. Despite these challenges, the convent offered a degree of autonomy and intellectual stimulation that was rare for women in the Middle Ages. Within the bustling medieval cities, women played a crucial role in the economic life of the community. They were integral in trades such as brewing, baking, and textile production. Some women even ran their own businesses, managing staff and negotiating contracts. Despite the many restrictions placed on women during the Middle Ages, these examples hint at the diverse roles women played and the spaces they carved out for themselves. Their lives were shaped by the social, economic, and religious norms of the time, but within these constraints, they were able to exert influence and shape their own destinies. As we continue to delve deeper into the intricate tapestry of women's lives in the Middle Ages, we will uncover more about their roles, their challenges, and their triumphs. From noble women to peasants, from nuns to city dwellers, each had a unique story to tell. Each left a mark on the world they inhabited. So, let's allow the gentle rhythm of their lives lull us into a deeper understanding of their world, and in doing so, may we find a peaceful slumber. In the Middle Ages, women were largely defined by their roles in society, often associated with their marital status or their religious affiliation. Marriage was a fundamental aspect of a woman's life, with most girls being betrothed by the age of 12 or 13. Betroths were similar to modern-day engagements, but with a greater degree of commitment. They were legally binding contracts that could only be broken under very specific circumstances. Once betrothed, a woman would move in with her husband's family and begin to learn the duties and responsibilities of a wife. Marriages during this time were often arranged for economic or political reasons. Love was not considered a prerequisite for marriage, and romantic affection was often viewed with suspicion. However, it's important to note that this did not mean love and affection were absent from medieval marriages. There are numerous historical accounts and pieces of literature from this period that demonstrate genuine affection and even passion between husband and wife. It was within the confines of marriage that women often held the most power and influence. They were expected to manage the household, which included overseeing the servants, maintaining the family's finances, and ensuring the welfare of the children. In the absence of their husbands, women could act as their representative in legal and financial matters. This gave them a certain amount of autonomy and authority, albeit within a very restricted scope. However, not all women were destined for marriage. Some chose to enter religious life, becoming nuns or abbesses. Life in a convent offered an alternative to the traditional roles of wife and mother, providing women with an opportunity for education and spiritual development. Despite the strict rules and regulations that governed convent life, many women found a degree of freedom and autonomy within the cloistered walls that was not available to them in the outside world. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of the female mystic. These were women who claimed to have direct personal experiences of the divine. Their visions and revelations were often recorded and disseminated, providing them with a platform to express their spiritual insights. Despite the potential risks, accusations of heresy were not uncommon. Many of these women became influential figures in their communities and beyond. Women during the Middle Ages also worked. They could be found in a variety of occupations, from brewing and baking to weaving and spinning. Some women even ran their own businesses. However, their work was often undervalued and underpaid. Despite this, it provided them with a source of income and, in some cases, a degree of independence. It's also worth noting the role of women in medieval warfare. While they were not typically combatants, women played crucial roles in supporting their armies. They cooked, cleaned, and tended to the wounded. Some even acted as spies or messengers. There are also accounts of women who donned armor and took up arms in defense of their homes and families, despite the restrictions and limitations placed on them. Women in the Middle Ages were not passive or powerless. They were active participants in their societies, contributing to the economy, the church, and the family. They navigated the challenges and opportunities presented by their time with strength, resilience, and resourcefulness. In conclusion, life for women in the Middle Ages was a complex interplay of societal expectations, religious beliefs, and personal agency. While their roles and opportunities were significantly constrained by the patriarchal norms of the time, they found ways to exercise power and influence within their given spheres. Whether as wives, mothers, nuns, mystics, workers, or warriors, women in the Middle Ages were integral to the functioning and survival of their societies. They were in every sense the unsung heroes of their time. As we delve deeper into our exploration of the life of women during medieval times, we find ourselves now in the bustling markets of the towns and cities. It was here in these vibrant centers of commerce and social interaction that many medieval women found their place in society. As one might imagine, the marketplace was a busy, lively place filled with the aromas of freshly baked bread, ripe fruits, and an array of other goods. While the notion of the medieval period often conjures up images of women confined to the domestic sphere, in reality, quite a number of them were active participants in the economic life of their towns. Women could be found selling everything, from food and drinks to textiles and even services such as laundry and nursing. They were bakers, brewers, butchers, and candlestick makers. Some women even managed inns or taverns. These women, often widows, were respected and integral members of their communities, capable of running a business and maintaining a household. A good example of this can be found in the records of the time. Take, for instance, the case of Marguerite Kemp, a 15th century businesswoman who ran a brewery and a grain mill. Marguerite's story is unique because she not only managed these enterprises, but she also wrote about her experiences, giving us a rare glimpse into the life of a working woman in the Middle Ages. Marguerite's tale speaks of the challenges she faced, her struggles with societal expectations, and her relentless determination. While it's true that many women in the Middle Ages were unable to read or write, the story of Marguerite Kemp provides evidence that some women were literate and indeed made significant contributions to the literary world. Women such as Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, and Christine de Pan authored works that have become classics of medieval literature. These women wrote about religion, philosophy, and even the plight of women in society, challenging the traditional roles and expectations of their time. These women were not the norm, of course. Most women, particularly those of the lower classes, had lives dominated by work. A peasant woman's day would start at dawn, tending to the animals, making cheese and butter, brewing ale, cooking, cleaning, and caring for her children. It was a relentless, physically demanding lifestyle with little time for rest or leisure. Despite the hardships, women found ways to express their creativity and skill. They might not have been creating grand tapestries or elaborate sculptures, but the everyday items they crafted, from the clothes they stitched to the bread they baked, were infused with their artistry. The intricate embroidery on a tunic, the pattern on a ceramic pot, or the design on a loaf of bread all bore the mark of their makers. In the Middle Ages, women also played a key role in health care. They were often the primary caregivers in their families, tending to the sick and the elderly. Many women became skilled in the use of herbs and natural remedies, and their knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Some women, like Hildegard of Bingen, combined their skills in healing with their religious vocations, becoming renowned for their knowledge of medicinal plants and their ability to heal. Yet, despite these contributions, women in the Middle Ages had to contend with a society that was largely patriarchal. Laws and customs often favored men, and women had limited rights and freedoms. A woman's place was largely determined by her marital status, and her options were often limited to marriage, the convent, or, in rare cases, a life of solitary struggle. Despite these challenges, women in the Middle Ages displayed a remarkable resilience and adaptability. They found ways to express their creativity, contribute to their communities, and carve out a place for themselves in a world that was often hostile to their ambitions. Their stories, while often overlooked in the grand narrative of history, are a testament to their strength and endurance. They remind us that behind the stereotypes and misconceptions, there lies a rich tapestry of lives lived with courage, determination, and grace. As we continue our exploration of the lives of medieval women, it is pertinent to acknowledge the role of religion. The church was the heart and soul of medieval life and wielded an enormous influence over every aspect of existence, including the lives of women. In the Middle Ages, religion permeated not just the spiritual realm, but also the political, social, and cultural spheres. Women in the Middle Ages were expected to be pious and devoted to their faith. They were taught from an early age about the virtues of modesty, obedience, and patience, as well as the importance of prayer and devotion. They were also encouraged to be charitable and to care for the less fortunate. As this was viewed as a path to spiritual salvation, many women became nuns, choosing to dedicate their lives to God and service. Convents offered a refuge for women who did not wish to marry or could not afford a dowie. Inside these religious institutions, women could receive an education, something often denied to them in the wider world. They learned to read and write, studied the Bible, and some even became accomplished scholars. The most famous example of such a woman is Hildegard of Bingen, a German nun of the 12th century who was an influential writer, composer, philosopher, and visionary. However, the Church also set many of the societal norms and expectations for women. It promoted the idea of women as the weaker sex, both physically and morally, and therefore in need of male guidance and protection. Women were often portrayed as either saints or sinners with little room for anything in between. These stereotypes reinforced the subordinate status of women and limited their opportunities. Despite these restrictions, some women found ways to exercise power and influence within the Church. They could not become priests or bishops, but they could become abbesses, the female equivalent of an abbot. Abbesses were in charge of convents and had considerable authority over their communities. They could own and manage property, make legal decisions, and some even had the power to excommunicate. However, the role of an abbess was not easy. They were expected to be models of virtue and to enforce the strict rules of the convent. They also had to navigate the complex politics of the Church and maintain good relations with male Church officials. Yet, despite these challenges, many women thrived in this role and used their position to make a difference in their communities. The Church also provided opportunities for women to become involved in local parish life. Women could join religious guilds, groups of lay people dedicated to a particular saint or cause. They could also participate in religious festivals and processions, which were major events in the medieval calendar. In these ways, women could contribute to the spiritual life of their community and gain a sense of purpose and belonging. Yet it is also important to remember that not all women in the Middle Ages were devoutly religious. Some women were skeptical of the Church and its teachings, while others were accused of heresy or witchcraft. These women faced persecution, and in some cases, even execution. The Church's attitude towards these women reveals the darker side of medieval religion and its impact on women's lives. In conclusion, the Church played a crucial role in the lives of medieval women. It offered opportunities for education, service, and leadership, but it also imposed strict norms and expectations. Women navigated this complex landscape with resilience and ingenuity, carving out spaces of autonomy and influence within a patriarchal system. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, we will explore further the ways in which women negotiated their place in this fascinating period of history. As the night draws on, let these stories of resilience and strength guide you into a peaceful slumber. As the night sky deepens and tranquility settles in, we continue our exploration of what life was like for women during the medieval times. We've covered aspects of their daily lives, their roles in society, religion, and the economy, and now we venture into an area that held significant importance throughout the medieval era. Marriage and family life. Marriage during the Middle Ages was not a matter of personal choice, but rather an institution designed to maintain the social and economic order. This was true for both men and women, but the impact was different for each sex. Women, particularly those of noble birth, were often married off at a young age to solidify alliances, settle disputes, or enhance the economic and social standing of their families. The bride's consent was technically necessary, but it was often obtained through pressure or manipulation. In contrast to romantic ideas of today, medieval marriages were typically strategic arrangements. Love was not a prerequisite for marriage. It was hoped that it might develop over time. The notion of courtly love, a romantic ideal that extolled the virtues of chivalry and passion, was largely confined to literature and the arts and did not have a substantial impact on the reality of marriage during this era. The bride would bring a dowry to the marriage, a collection of goods, property, or money that became the husband's upon marriage. This dowry system served not only as a form of economic security for the woman, but also as a way to attract desirable suitors. Once married, a woman's main duty was to bear children. The high infant mortality rate and the need for heirs meant that women were often pregnant. In addition to childbearing, women were expected to manage the household. This included tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and supervising servants, but also involved managing the finances and maintaining the estate in her husband's absence. Despite the constraints and challenges faced by medieval women, they were not passive or powerless. They held positions of influence within the household, and their work was vital to the survival and prosperity of their families. Moreover, some women were able to exercise power in other ways. For example, a widow could inherit her husband's property and title and could wield considerable influence. The Church also offered opportunities for women. While it's true that the medieval Church was a patriarchal institution, it did offer women certain roles and positions of authority. Women could become nuns, and within the cloistered walls of a convent, they could study, write, and participate in intellectual and spiritual pursuits that were often denied to them in the secular world. At the end of the day, life for women in the Middle Ages was complex and varied. It was shaped by a multitude of factors, including social status, geographical location, and individual circumstances. Women faced many challenges, but they also found ways to navigate the complexities of their world. So as we delve deeper into the night, let's reflect on the resilience, adaptability, and strength of these medieval women. Their stories, often hidden in the shadows of history, are an integral part of our shared past. As we continue to explore, we gain a more nuanced understanding of a time period that is often misunderstood and oversimplified. Each piece of knowledge not only brings us closer to understanding the past, but also provides us with insights into the present. As you drift further into sleep, let your mind wander through the ages. Imagine the castles and markets, the fields and forests, the bustling households and quiet convents. Picture the women who lived, worked, and dreamed within these spaces. Their lives so different from our own, yet marked by the same hopes, fears, and desires that continue to shape our world today. Let these stories guide you into a peaceful slumber and awaken you with a deeper understanding and appreciation of our shared human history. In our exploration of the lives of women in medieval times, we've traversed various societal roles and expectations. We've ventured into the realms of noble women and peasant women and uncovered the hard truths about their daily lives. As we drift deeper into the tapestry of history, we find ourselves now turning to the topic of love, marriage, and family life. Love in the medieval age was a multi-faceted concept. It was a romantic ideal, a practical necessity, and a societal duty. For women, it was often a complex negotiation between personal feelings, societal expectations, and family obligations. In some cases, marriages were arranged by families to secure political alliances or economic benefits. In others, they were the result of mutual affection and personal choice. Despite the prevalence of arranged marriages in the upper classes, contemporary literature and historical records suggest that love and affection were not uncommon in medieval marriages. Once married, a woman's primary responsibilities were to manage the household and bear children. In noble families, these responsibilities could be extensive and complex, involving the management of large estates, servants, and intricate family. Politics? For peasant women, these tasks were more immediate and physical, involving hard labor in the fields and the home. Despite these differences, women in both classes were expected to be obedient to their husbands, a societal expectation that was enforced by both law and custom. Childbearing was considered one of the most important roles for a woman in medieval society. Women were expected to produce heirs, particularly in the upper classes, where the continuation of the family line was a matter of political and economic importance. They were also expected to provide for the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of their children. This included not only nursing and nurturing, but also educating and disciplining. In the context of family life, women in the medieval age also held a significant spiritual role. They were seen as the moral compass of the family, responsible for instilling Christian values in their children and maintaining the spiritual health of the household. This role was heavily influenced by the Church, which emphasized the importance of women's piety and moral virtue. The Church also played a significant role in shaping societal attitudes towards women and marriage. It promoted the idea of marriage as a sacred union with the woman as a submissive partner. However, it also offered women some protections, such as the right to consent to marriage and the right to own property in their own name. Nevertheless, women's rights and freedoms were severely limited in comparison to men. They were subject to their husband's authority and had little legal recourse in cases of abuse or maltreatment. This was particularly true for women in the lower classes who had fewer resources and less social standing to protect them. As we drift off into the comforting embrace of sleep, it is important to remember the bravery and resilience of these women. They navigated a world that was often harsh and unforgiving, carving out their own spaces of love, family, and faith within it. Despite the limitations imposed upon them, they found ways to express their individuality, their desires, and their dreams. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the freedoms and opportunities that women enjoy today. As we now transition into the next section, we will delve into the fascinating world of women's work during the medieval times. From the bustling markets to the quiet monasteries, we will uncover the many ways in which women contributed to the economic and cultural life of their societies. But for now, let us rest and rejuvenate, secure in the knowledge that we are continuing our journey through history together. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. As we continue our exploration into the lives of women in the medieval period, we now turn our attention to an often overlooked aspect of their existence, the influence of religion and spirituality. Women's lives in the Middle Ages were deeply intertwined with the Church, which was a central pillar of medieval society. Not only did it provide spiritual guidance, but it also served as a regulator of social norms and moral standards. The Church taught that women, like men, were made in the image of God and were equally capable of achieving salvation. However, women were also seen as weaker, more prone to sin, and in need of protection. This belief stemmed from interpretations of the Bible, particularly the story of Adam and Eve, where Eve was depicted as being created from Adam's rib, suggesting a subordinate status. The tale of Eve yielding to the serpent's temptation and causing the fall of man was also used to justify women's perceived moral weakness. Despite these negative stereotypes, the Church also honored the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God, providing a positive, although unattainable model of womanhood. Women were expected to observe religious practices diligently, and their day-to-day lives were punctuated by prayer. They were also responsible for instilling Christian values in their children. Many women found solace and a sense of purpose in their faith, particularly given the harsh realities of medieval life. The Church offered a sense of hope and reassurance, promising eternal life in heaven for those who lived in accordance with God's laws. However, the Church was not just a spiritual institution. It was also a political and economic powerhouse, owning vast amounts of land and wealth. This power was overwhelmingly in the hands of men, with women largely excluded from positions of authority. Women could not become priests, bishops, or popes, and were generally barred from delivering sermons or administering sacraments. Despite these restrictions, some women found ways to carve out influential roles within the Church. Convents offered one of the few opportunities for women to gain an education and to escape the confines of marriage and motherhood. Nuns, like monks, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation, but also undertook practical work such as nursing the sick, teaching, and making manuscripts. Some nuns rose to become abbesses, gaining substantial power and responsibility within their religious communities. There were also a number of notable female mystics during the Middle Ages, women who claimed to have direct personal experiences of God. Figures like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen wrote influential theological works and were respected for their spiritual insights. Their writings provide a valuable window into the spiritual lives of medieval women, demonstrating their capacity for deep theological thought and their desire for a personal relationship with God. Despite the restrictions placed on them, women in the Middle Ages were not passive recipients of church teachings. They found ways to negotiate their own spiritual paths, whether through the relative freedom of the convent, the mystical pursuit of a direct connection with God, or the everyday piety of the home. Their stories remind us that even within the constraints of a male-dominated society, women have always found ways to assert their agency and shape their own experiences. As we move forward in our exploration, we will examine another crucial aspect of women's lives during the Middle Ages, their roles in the world of work. But for now, let this image of the medieval woman as a spiritual being, navigating the complexities of faith and morality within the confines of a male-dominated church, guide your dreams and thoughts as you drift further into restful sleep. As we continue to journey through the experiences of women during the medieval times, we come now to the realm of medicine, healthcare, and childbirth. It is important to understand that in this period, the separation between the spiritual and the physical was not as distinct as it is today. Many of the medical practices were bound up in religion and superstition. Women played a significant role in healthcare during the medieval times. They were often the caregivers within their own households, a role that extended to the community at large. This was particularly true in rural areas where professional medical help was scarce. Women would use a combination of herbs, prayer, and practical knowledge to tend the sick. However, in more urban areas, the professional role of the healer began to be monopolized by men, with women often being relegated to the role of assisting in surgeries or acting as midwives. Speaking of midwives, childbirth was a particularly risky endeavor during the medieval period. The mortality rate for mothers was high due to complications during delivery and the lack of understanding about hygiene. The birthing process was a community event, often involving female relatives and neighbors, led by the midwife, who was a woman trained in childbirth. The midwife's knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, rather than being academically taught. An interesting aspect of medieval medicine was the belief in wise women. These were women who were believed to have special knowledge or powers to heal. They were often older women, respected and feared in equal measure. They were considered to be in touch with the spiritual world and could use this connection to heal physical ailments. Apart from physical health, mental health was also a concern during the medieval times. Although it was not understood in the same way as we understand it today, conditions that we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were often attributed to spiritual or demonic influence. Treatments ranged from prayer and fasting to more drastic measures such as exorcism. In the realm of education, opportunities for women were limited. Most women were illiterate, and those who could read and write were usually from the nobility or the church. It was generally believed that women did not need to be educated, as their primary role was to bear and raise children. However, there were exceptions. Some women, particularly those in religious orders, were highly educated. They were able to study art, music, and literature, and some even wrote influential theological works. Despite these restrictions, women found ways to influence and shape their world. They might not have had access to formal education, but they were often skilled in herbalism, weaving, brewing, and a host of other practical skills. They played crucial roles within their communities, often acting as peacemakers, mediators, and counselors. The lives of women during the medieval times were marked by hardship and restrictions, but also by resilience and resourcefulness. They navigated a world that often undervalued them, finding ways to express their creativity, spirituality, and intellect within the constraints placed upon them. As we continue to navigate the experiences of women during this historical period, we will discover that their stories are not just tales of subjugation, but also narratives of resistance, innovation, and strength. In our next section, we will delve into the daily routines and social activities of women in the medieval times, providing a vivid glimpse into their everyday lives. So close your eyes and let the soothing cadence of history lull you into a peaceful slumber as we prepare to journey further back in time. In the historical tapestry that is the Middle Ages, the thread of women's lives weaves a complex pattern. As we delve deeper into the period spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, we find that the lives of women during these times were far from homogeneous. Their experiences and roles were largely influenced by their social status, geographical location, and the prevailing cultural norms of the time. The roles of women in the medieval period were multifaceted. They were mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters. But they were also business owners, healers, and farmers. The roles they occupied were often determined by their marital status and their lineage. Unmarried women, including widows, had more legal rights than their married counterparts. They could own property, enter into contracts, and even run businesses. Understandably, these were significant roles that contributed to the economic fabric of the society. Married women, on the other hand, were expected to bear and raise children, maintain the household, and support their husbands' occupations. They had fewer legal rights than unmarried women due to the doctrine of cover, which held that a woman was covered by her husband's identity and therefore had no separate legal existence. However, this did not mean that they were inactive or unimportant. On the contrary, they played crucial roles in managing their households, which often included overseeing servants, managing finances, and taking care of agricultural duties. Women of noble birth lived lives that were vastly different from those of the lower classes. They were usually educated, often in convents, and they were expected to be well-versed in social etiquette. These women had more leisure time and were often involved in political machinations. They could act as regents for their underage sons and had a significant influence on court politics. In stark contrast, peasant women had little time for leisure or education. Their lives were consumed by labor-intensive work. They worked alongside their husbands in the fields, tended to animals, brewed beer, cooked, cleaned, and cared for the children. Despite the harshness of their existence, They were integral to the survival of their families and the broader community. Religion played a significant role in the lives of medieval women. The church provided opportunities for women that were not available in secular society. Women could become nuns, and in doing so could receive an education and escape the traditional roles of wife and mother. Some women even achieved high status within the church, such as Hildegard of Bingen, a renowned abbess, writer, composer, and philosopher. However, the church also imposed strictures on women. It propagated the idea of women as the weaker sex, both physically and morally. Women were viewed as the daughters of Eve, who was blamed for humanity's original sin. This conception of women as inherently sinful contributed to the marginalization and persecution of women, most notably in the witch trials that occurred during the later Middle Ages. The Middle Ages also saw significant developments in medicine, many of which were related to women's health. Midwives played a vital role in this aspect. They were often the primary health care providers for women and were involved in all stages of childbirth. Despite their importance, they were sometimes viewed with suspicion, and their practices were often at odds with the Church's teachings. In conclusion, life for women in the Middle Ages was a complex interplay of roles, expectations, and opportunities. Despite the challenges they faced, they found ways to navigate their world and leave their mark on history. They were far more than passive observers of their time. They were active participants, shaping and being shaped by the world around them. As we delve deeper into history, we find that their stories are not just about women in the Middle Ages, but about the human experience in all its complexity and diversity. In our journey through the annals of history, we have reached the medieval period, a time of knights, castles, and chivalry. Yet beyond these romanticized images lies the reality of everyday life, particularly for women. As we delve into the complexities of medieval womanhood, let our minds wander back to the cobblestone streets, the bustling marketplaces, and the hushed whispers of the cloister. The first thing to understand is that the term medieval encompasses a large span of time and a wide variety of cultures. The medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, lasted from roughly the 5th to the 15th century and covered all of Europe. Consequently, experiences of women during this era were not monolithic and varied greatly depending on their geographical location, social status, and the specific time period. At the dawn of the Middle Ages, the social structure was predominantly feudal. This hierarchical system placed the king at the top, followed by the nobility, knights, and clergy, with peasants at the bottom. As expected, women's roles and responsibilities were largely dictated by their position within this hierarchy. Noble women, although privileged, often found their lives strictly regulated. They were expected to run the household, bear children, and support their husbands. They were also expected to maintain the family's social standing through their behavior and manners. Despite these restrictions, noble women could yield considerable power. In the absence of their husbands, they could manage estates, oversee serfs, and even defend their homes. Some, like Helena of Aquitaine, became influential political figures in their own right. Knights' wives and daughters had somewhat similar responsibilities as their noble counterparts, but with fewer resources. They learned skills like weaving, brewing, and animal husbandry to support their families. Peasant women arguably had the hardest lives. They worked tirelessly, tending to the fields, caring for livestock, and managing household tasks. Childbirth was a perilous event, with many women dying due to complications. Despite these hardships, they were the backbone of the medieval economy, contributing significantly to agricultural production. In contrast to the secular world, the Church offered a different path for women. While the Church maintained traditional gender roles, it also provided opportunities for women to lead lives of devotion and service. Women could become nuns, dedicating their lives to prayer and charity. They could also become mystics, theologians, or anchors living a life of seclusion for spiritual purposes. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of beguines, lay religious women who lived in semi-monastic communities. They didn't take lifelong vows, allowing them the flexibility to leave the community if they chose to marry or for any other reason. Education was not a common privilege for women during this era. Noble women might receive some education, often from private tutors or learned family members. They were typically taught to read and write and sometimes even learned Latin. Peasant. Women, on the other hand, were largely illiterate. Yet despite these limitations, some women became renowned for their intellectual pursuits. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, and visionary. Julian of Norwich, an insurer, wrote the earliest surviving book in the English language to be written by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love. The medieval period was a time of contrasts for women. On one hand, they faced numerous restrictions and hardships. On the other hand, they also found ways to exercise power, express their spirituality, and contribute to their societies. As we continue our exploration, allow yourself to drift deeper into the realm of dreams, guided by the stories of these women and their enduring spirit. In the medieval period, a woman's place was primarily in the home, where she would manage the household and raise the children. This role was considered both a duty and a privilege, and women would often take great pride in maintaining a well-ordered home, cooking and preparing meals, and caring for the family. However, these domestic responsibilities did not preclude women from participating in the wider world. Indeed, women in the medieval era were often involved in various aspects of societal life, including commerce, politics, and even warfare. Within the home, women were responsible for a wide range of tasks, many of which required considerable skill. These included baking, brewing, weaving, sewing, and maintaining the family's herb garden. In addition to these tasks, women would also care for the animals, milk the cows, and tend to the poultry. In rural areas, women would often also be responsible for sowing and harvesting the crops. Despite the hard work, many women found great satisfaction in these tasks, and they were often the backbone of the family's economy. In the towns and cities, women were also key players in the medieval economy. They would often run their own businesses, selling goods in the market or offering services such as laundry or brewing. Some women even became wealthy merchants in their own right, trading in goods such as textiles, spices, and precious metals. These women would often be highly respected in their communities, and they could wield considerable influence. Women also played a significant role in the political life of the medieval world. They could inherit property and titles, and they often acted as regents for their underage sons or absent husbands. Some women rose to positions of great power, such as Helena of Aquitaine, who was queen of both France and England, and Matilda of Tuscany, who was a key player in the politics of Italy. In times of war, women could also play a role. Some, like Joan of Arc, took up arms and led armies into battle. Others, like Bangaria of Navarre, accompanied their husbands on crusade and helped to administer their lands in their absence. Religion was also a major part of women's lives in the medieval era. Many women chose to enter the church as nuns, where they could dedicate their lives to prayer and contemplation. Others, like Hildegard of Bingen, became influential theologians and spiritual leaders. Education was not generally available to women in the medieval era, but there were exceptions. Some noble women were educated by tutors in their homes, learning to read and write, as well as studying subjects such as history and philosophy. A few women even went on to become scholars, writing books and treatises on a variety of subjects. Despite the many roles that women played in the medieval world, it is important to remember that this was still a patriarchal society. Women were generally considered to be inferior to men, and they were often subject to their husband's authority. However, this did not mean that women were powerless. They often found ways to exert influence and achieve their goals, whether through diplomacy, cunning, or force of personality. The lives of women in the medieval period were complex and varied, shaped by their social status, their family circumstances, and the wider cultural and political context in which they lived. They faced many challenges, but they also had opportunities for influence and achievement. Their stories provide a fascinating insight into a world that was very different from our own, but also strikingly similar in many ways. As we delve further into the tapestry of medieval women's lives, we find ourselves in the realm of women in the workforce. It is a common misconception that women during this era were confined to their homes, performing only household chores. But in truth, women participated actively in the medieval economy, often managing their own businesses and trades. Consider the alehouse, a ubiquitous establishment in medieval towns. Brewing and selling ale was a trade dominated by women known as alewives. These women had an intimate knowledge of fermentation processes and were skilled entrepreneurs. While men were off at war or laboring in the fields, alewives kept the ale flowing, an essential task given that ale was safer to drink than water in a time before modern sanitation. While these women did face criticism and suspicion, often depicted as deceitful or immoral in contemporary literature and art, their economic contribution was undeniable. Similarly, women were also heavily involved in textile production. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were considered women's work, and many women spun wool into yarn at home, a task so common it was often used as a metaphor for women's work in general. But beyond the home, there were also professional female weavers and seamstresses. Some women even ran their own textile workshops, managing apprentices and journeymen, just like their male counterparts. In the bustling markets of medieval towns and cities, women were a common sight. Many were market sellers, hawking everything from food to fabric. They set up their stalls in the market square, shouting out the quality of their goods to anyone who would listen. These women had to be shrewd negotiators, capable of haggling with the best of them. And in an era without standardized weights and measures, they also needed a keen eye to ensure they were not being cheated. But women's work was not confined to these traditionally female occupations. Records show that women worked in a wide variety of trades. There were female bakers, butchers, and fishmongers. There were women who worked in metal trades as blacksmiths, silversmiths, and potter. Some women were even employed in construction, hauling water and bricks for the men who built the great cathedrals and castles of the era. Not all women were workers, though. There were also women of wealth and power. Noble women managed vast estates in their husbands' absence, making decisions about crops, tenants, and finances. They were responsible for the welfare of the people. Living on their lands and their decisions could mean the difference between prosperity and famine. These women had to be skilled administrators and diplomats, navigating the complex social and political waters of the medieval world. Women also found opportunities in the church. Some became nuns, devoting their lives to prayer and service. Convents could offer a life of relative freedom and intellectual stimulation, where women could study, write, and engage in scholarly debate. Some nuns became influential figures in their own right, like Hildegard of Bingen, a German nun who was a renowned composer, philosopher, and visionary. But life was not always easy for these working women. They were paid less than men, and their work was often undervalued. They faced restrictions on their ability to own property or enter into contracts, and they lived in a world where their worth was often defined by their ability to bear children. Yet, despite these challenges, they persevered, carving out lives of dignity and purpose. As we reflect on the lives of these medieval women, we are reminded of the diversity and complexity of women's experiences throughout history. They were not just passive figures confined to the domestic sphere. They were workers, entrepreneurs, managers, and scholars. They were active contributors to the economic, social, and cultural life of their communities. And their stories continue to inspire us today as we strive for a world in which all women are valued for their talents and contributions. So, as we drift into the realm of dreams, let us carry with us the image of these remarkable women, the alewives with their bubbling brews, the market sellers with their colorful stalls, the noble women with their sprawling estates, and the nuns with their quiet devotion. Let their stories resonate with us, reminding us of the resilience and strength of women throughout the ages. As we close our eyes and surrender to sleep, let us honor these women of the past and all the women who continue to shape our world today. Good night. As we delve further into the life of women during the medieval times, it becomes increasingly clear that their roles, responsibilities, and experiences were as diverse as they were complex. In this section, we shall explore the lives of women who lived under the feudal system, their involvement in the church, and the ways education and literacy shaped their existence. In feudal societies, women's lives were largely dictated by their social standing. At the very top of the hierarchy were noble women who enjoyed certain privileges and responsibilities. They were generally married off at a young age, often for political reasons or to forge alliances among noble families. Despite the political nature of these marriages, it would be erroneous to assume that noble women were merely pawns in these transactions. Many noble women played active roles in managing their estates, particularly when their husbands were away, which was often the case during wars or crusades. These women were not only responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the estate, but also for making important decisions that could impact their families and dependents. This gave them a certain degree of power and influence, although it was always within the confines of a patriarchal society. On the other hand, peasant women, who made up a significant portion of the population, lived a life of hard labor. They worked alongside men in the fields, tended to animals, and cared for the household. Their days were long, and their work was physically demanding. Despite their arduous lives, peasant women, like their noble counterparts, also had a certain level of autonomy. They were integral to the survival of their families and communities, not just as wives, mothers, and daughters, but also as workers and providers. The church, too, played a crucial role in the lives of medieval women. While the church's teachings reinforced societal expectations of women as subservient and morally weaker than men, it also provided opportunities for women to lead spiritual lives. Women could become nuns, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and devoting their lives to prayer and service. Convents often served as places of education for women where they could learn to read and write and gain knowledge about religion, medicine, and other subjects. Some women, like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, became influential figures within the church, contributing to theological discourse and leaving behind important works of spiritual literature. Education and literacy were generally limited to the upper classes and the clergy, but there were exceptions. In some areas, particularly in towns and cities, girls might have attended schools run by the church or received private lessons from tutors. Women who were literate often used their skills to manage household accounts, correspond with relatives or business associates, and read for pleasure or spiritual edification. While the majority of women in the Middle Ages were likely illiterate, those who had access to education could exert a certain level of influence within their families and communities. In conclusion, while women in the Middle Ages were undeniably constrained by societal norms and expectations, they also navigated these constraints in ways that allowed them to exert influence, fulfill their responsibilities, and lead meaningful lives. Whether they were noble women managing vast estates, peasant women working tirelessly to provide for their families, or nuns contributing to the spiritual life of their communities, Medieval women were not passive spectators, but active participants in their own lives and in the world around them. As we delve further into this fascinating period of history, let's continue to challenge our preconceptions and seek a more nuanced understanding of the lives of women in the medieval times. In the next section, we will explore the role of women in art and culture, their involvement in trade and commerce, and the ways in which they resisted and negotiated societal norms to carve out spaces for themselves. For now, as you drift further into a state of relaxation, let the stories of these resilient women inspire you with their strength, their courage, and their unwavering spirit. In the previous sections, we have explored the general landscape of the lives of medieval women, their roles within the family, and their involvement in the labor force. Now we shall delve deeper into the distinct roles women played in the religious and political landscape of the medieval era. The church was an integral part of medieval society, and women played a significant role in various religious capacities. Though their involvement was often overlooked or underestimated, many women served as nuns, devoting their lives to the pursuit of spirituality. The convent provided a refuge for women from the hardships of the outside world, and for some, it was a space for intellectual growth and personal development. A notable example is Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess who made significant contributions to music thought and theology in the 12th century. Her works are still respected and studied today, and she was ultimately canonized as a saint. Yet the church was not an entirely egalitarian institution. Women were often barred from serving as priests or bishops. They could not give sermons, and their access to religious texts was limited. This did not stop some women from challenging these restrictions. Women like Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp used mystical experiences as a platform to share their spiritual insights. They wrote about their visions and ideas, taking on the role of spiritual guides despite the limitations imposed on them. In the political sphere, women's roles were even more complex. Queens and noblewomen wielded considerable influence, often serving as regents during their husbands' or sons' absences. They were involved in diplomacy, maintaining relationships with other nobles and kingdoms, and even leading troops into battle in some instances. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one such powerful queen who was known for her political acumen and influence. As the queen of both France and England at different times, she played a pivotal role in shaping the politics of the 12th century. However, their political power often hinged on their relationships with men. When their husbands or sons were present, these women were expected to step back into a supporting role. Yet they were often the power behind the throne, quietly influencing decisions and shaping policy. Common women, on the other hand, had less political influence. They could not hold office or vote, and their voices were often silenced in political matters. However, they still found ways to make their influence felt. Women participated in revolts, petitioned their lords for justice, and even formed guilds to protect their interests. They might not have had formal political power, but they were far from passive. It is important to remember that the experiences of women in the Middle Ages were diverse. While some women were cloistered nuns, others were powerful queens. Some were artisans and laborers. Others were wives and mothers. They faced restrictions and challenges, but they also found ways to navigate these limitations and make their voices heard. In religion and politics, as in every aspect of medieval life, women were active participants, shaping the world around them in ways both seen and unseen. In the next section, we will delve into the cultural and social lives of medieval women, exploring their roles as patrons of the arts, their involvement in the world of fashion, and their participation in popular pastimes. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, we will gain a deeper understanding of the richness and complexity of women's lives during this era. So, as you close your eyes and prepare to drift into sleep, imagine the bustling streets of a medieval city. the quiet serenity of a convent, or the grandeur of a royal court. Remember the women who lived, loved, worked, and dreamed in these spaces, their stories woven into the tapestry of history. Good night. As we continue our journey through the complex tapestry of women's lives in the medieval era, let's venture into the realm of marriage and family life. This aspect of a woman's existence, like many others during this period, was deeply influenced by societal expectations and the rule of the church. A medieval woman's life was often predestined to follow a certain trajectory. She was expected to marry, bear children, and be under the guardianship of a man. First her father, then her husband. The concept of marriage during the Middle Ages was primarily an economic and strategic arrangement between families rather than a union of love. The woman, often a mere girl by our standards, had little to no say in the matter. Marriages were arranged by the families of the bride and groom with the primary goal of promoting their social standing or wealth. Doweys, a sum of money or property, brought by the bride to her husband upon marriage, were common. The size of the dowry often determined the type of husband a woman could attract. If a woman's family was poor and could not provide a substantial dowry, she might be forced to enter a convent or remain a spinster, a term used for an unmarried woman. In the rare instances where love did bloom within these arranged marriages, it was often seen as an added bonus, not a prerequisite. The idea of romantic love as the foundation of marriage is a relatively modern concept, and it would have been quite foreign to a medieval woman. Once married, a woman's main responsibilities were to bear children and manage the household. It's important to note, however, that managing the household in medieval times was a far cry from our present-day notion of homemaking. It involved overseeing servants, handling finances, and even managing the family's agricultural affairs, making it a considerable and challenging role. Childbearing, on the other hand, was a dangerous business. Without the medical knowledge and technology we have today, many women died in childbirth. It was also not uncommon for children to perish in infancy, making the struggle to secure a lineage and heir a fraught and heart-wrenching one. The church played a significant role in the lives of married women. It promoted the idea of marital fidelity and prohibited divorce. Despite this, it was not uncommon for men, particularly those of higher social standing, to have mistresses. Women, however, were expected to remain faithful under the threat of severe punishment. Despite the church's influence, it was not completely successful in controlling the behavior of all medieval women. Some women defied societal norms and expectations to chart their own paths. They would become influential figures in the realms of religion, literature, and even politics. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen consort of both France and England, was a powerful figure in her own right. She participated in the Second Crusade, ruled as regent in her husband's absence, and was the mother of 3 kings. She defied the traditional expectations of medieval women and demonstrated that women could wield significant power. In the realm of literature, women like Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp made significant contributions. Julian, an anchor, is known for her work Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English known to have been written by a woman. Kempe, on the other hand, is remembered for her autobiographical work, The Book of Margerie. Kempe, which provides a rare and valuable insight into the spiritual life of a laywoman in the Middle Ages. As we explore the lives of these exceptional women, it's important to remember that they were the exceptions, not the norm. Most women in the Middle Ages lived quiet domestic lives, bound by societal expectations and the rule of the church. Yet even within these constraints, they found ways to influence their world, to express their creativity, and to survive in a time that was often harsh and unforgiving. As we draw the curtain on this section, let us reflect on the courage and resilience of these medieval women. Their lives may have been vastly different from ours, but their spirit and tenacity continue. to inspire us today. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the religious life of women during these times, exploring how faith influenced their everyday lives and offered them a unique space to wield influence. As our journey through the life of women in the medieval era continues, we find ourselves delving into the sphere of education. A common misconception is that education was only the privilege of men during this time. However, while it's true that opportunities for formal education were largely limited to men, it does not mean that women were entirely uneducated. In fact, women of varying social classes had different ways to learn and acquire knowledge, although their learning was mostly focused on their roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers. In the early Middle Ages, education was primarily an oral tradition, focused on the learning of songs, folk tales, and moral lessons. These would have been passed down from mother to daughter, as well as within the wider community. Women of noble birth were often taught by tutors in the household, focusing on subjects like reading, writing, arithmetic, but also etiquette, music, and even languages. This education was designed to prepare them for their future role in managing a household and being a suitable spouse for a noble husband. For women of lower classes, education was more practical, focused on the skills needed for their future roles. These could include spinning and weaving, cooking, and basic medical care. They learned by observing and assisting their mothers and other women in their community. However, despite the practical nature of their education, we should not underestimate its value. These skills were essential for the survival of the family and the community, and women were respected for their expertise in these areas. In the poor, monastic life education for women reached a different level. The convent was one of the few places in the Middle Ages where women could receive a formal education. Nuns learned to read and write in Latin, and they studied the Bible and other religious texts. Some convents even had libraries where the nuns could read and study a wide range of subjects from theology to philosophy and science. Some of these women became well known for their intellectual achievements. For example, the nun Hildegard of Bingen was a renowned writer, composer, philosopher, and mystic. Her works were influential, both within and beyond the confines of the convent. Yet, as the Middle Ages progressed, the opportunities for women's education began to decline. The rise of universities, which were exclusively for men, meant that formal education became increasingly associated with masculinity. Women were pushed out of the sphere of education, and their roles became more confined to the domestic sphere. This was a step back for women's education, and it would take centuries to regain the ground that had been lost. Despite these setbacks, women continued to learn and to pass on their knowledge. They found ways to circum the barriers placed in their way, learning from each other and from the world around them. They wrote, they read, they composed, they painted, and they debated, often under the radar of the male-dominated society. In conclusion, while women's education in the medieval ages was undeniably limited compared to that of men, it is important to remember that women were not merely passive recipients of their circumstances. They found ways to learn, to create, and to contribute to their societies. They used their knowledge and skills to navigate a world that was often hostile to them, and in doing so, they left a lasting legacy that still endures today. As we drift further into the night, let us take a moment to appreciate the resilience and resourcefulness of these women. They remind us that learning is not just about formal education, but also about the acquisition of skills, the sharing of wisdom, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge, even in the face of adversity. And so, as we close our eyes and prepare to sleep, let's carry with us the lessons that they have taught us to face tomorrow's challenges with courage and determination. As we continue to delve into the fascinating history of women during medieval times, let us now turn our attention to the significant roles women played in the world of business and trade. It may come as a surprise to some, but during this era, Women were not strictly confined to their homes and were in fact actively involved in various commercial activities, despite the numerous challenges and limitations that society placed upon them. Women found ways to contribute to the economy and ensure their own financial independence. In many medieval cities, women were common participants in the markets. They were seen selling diverse goods from food to textiles and sometimes even precious metals. In some cases, women ran their own workshops. These female business owners managed employees, negotiated transactions, and even traveled to other cities to forge trading connections. This was not a small feat considering the societal constraints that typically limited women's mobility and independence. Perhaps one of the most well-known examples of a successful businesswoman was Dame Juliana Berners. Berners was a 15th century English woman who was rumored to be the prioress of the Priory of St. Mary of Sopwell in Hertfordshire. Aside from her religious duties, Berners was also a prolific writer and businesswoman. She wrote extensively on different subjects such as heraldry, hawking, and hunting. Moreover, she was known for her printing business, which was quite a rarity for women at that time. The guild system also played an essential role in enabling women to participate in commerce. Guilds were associations of artisans or merchants who controlled the practice of their craft in a particular town. Women could become members of these guilds and benefit from the protection and support they offered. In some places, there were even guilds that were specifically for women. These guilds were usually associated with feminine crafts, such as spinning, weaving, or brewing. However, it is important to note that not all women had equal opportunities in the world of business. Women of the lower classes, for example, were often limited to selling goods in the market or working as laborers in workshops. In contrast, women from the upper classes had the resources and connections to establish more lucrative businesses. Moreover, widows had more opportunities compared to other women. This was because under the law, a widow could inherit her husband's property and continue his business. Many widows took advantage of this and became successful businesswomen in their own right. They were able to maintain their independence and secure a comfortable life for themselves and their children. There were also women who chose to become alewives or female brewers. This was a popular choice because brewing was a task that could be done at home while also attending to other domestic responsibilities. However, alewives often faced negative stereotypes and were frequently accused of dishonest practices. Despite these challenges, the role of women in the medieval economy should not be downplayed. Their contribution was crucial in maintaining the economic stability of their households and communities. There were even instances when women's earnings were the primary source of income for their families. As we have seen, the life of a woman in medieval times was not an easy one. Yet they found ways to navigate the constraints of their society and carve out their own paths. Whether they were queens, nuns, peasants, or businesswomen, they played pivotal roles in the shaping of their world. Their stories, albeit often overlooked, are an essential part of our history and deserve to be remembered and celebrated. As we slowly drift off to sleep, let us reflect on these brave and resilient women, their relentless spirit, and their ability to rise above the challenges of their time, serve as an inspiration for us all. May their stories remind us of the strength and resilience inherent in each of us, ready to be unleashed when faced with life's adversities. With that thought, let us continue to journey through the realm of dreams, guided by the tales of these remarkable medieval women. As we delve deeper into the complex tapestry of medieval life for women, it is essential to recognize the role of religion, which was both a source of comfort and a cause of suffering. The Christian Church was the dominant religious institution during the Middle Ages, and it wielded significant influence over all aspects of life, including the lives of women. The Church provided some opportunities for women, such as the chance to serve as nuns or abbesses in convents, but it also imposed severe restrictions. Women who chose to devote their lives to religion were expected to live in accordance with strict rules of chastity, obedience, and poverty. They were also often required to cut off contact with the outside world, including their families. The Church's teachings reinforced the notion that women were inferior to men, both physically and morally, and these attitudes permeated society at large. Despite these considerable obstacles, some women managed to exert influence within the Church. The best-known example is perhaps Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess who lived during the 12th century. Hildegard was a renowned writer, composer, philosopher, Christian mystic, and visionary who made significant contributions to theology and natural history. She was also a skilled herbalist and healer, and her works on medicine and the natural world were widely respected. Yet Hildegard was the exception, not the rule. Most women, whether they lived within the cloistered walls of a convent or in the wider world, had little power or influence. They were largely confined to the private sphere, responsible for managing the household and raising children. The drudgery of their daily lives was punctuated by frequent childbirth, which was both physically exhausting and dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were high, and many women lived in fear of dying in childbirth. Despite these hardships, women found ways to express themselves creatively. They spun stories and songs, created beautiful tapestries and embroidery, and even wrote poetry. Some women, like Christine Despins, a French author and poet, were able to break through societal constraints to make a name for themselves in the literary world. Christine Despins' works challenged the misogynistic attitudes of her time and advocated for women's intellectual capabilities. Her most famous work, The City of Ladies, was a defense of women and is considered one of the earliest feminist writings in the realms of business and trade. Women also played a role, although their participation was limited. Women could work as brewers, bakers, weavers, and midwives, among other trades. Some women even ran businesses, although this was rare. In general, women's work was undervalued and underpaid, and they had few opportunities to amass wealth or gain economic independence. As we conclude our exploration of women's lives in the Middle Ages, it is essential to acknowledge the diversity of women's experiences. The lives of noblewomen were markedly different from those of peasant women, and the lives of nuns differed still further. Women's experiences were shaped not only by their gender, but also by their social class, geographical location, and personal circumstances. Yet, despite the hardships they faced, women in the Middle Ages demonstrated remarkable resilience and resourcefulness. They navigated a society that did not value them as equals, and they found ways to express their creativity, spirituality, and intellect. They cared for their families, ran households, worked, and even ruled. Their stories, often overlooked in conventional histories, provide us with a richer, more nuanced understanding of the Middle Ages. As we drift into the realm of sleep, let us remember the women of the Middle Ages, their struggles, their victories, their everyday lives. Let us honor their resilience, their creativity, and their strength. They were not just passive spectators to history. They were active participants, shaping the world around them in ways both small and significant. Their legacy lives on, echoing through the centuries and touching our lives today.